As one of the most celebrated cinematographers in the history of motion pictures, Conrad Hall helped redefine the language of film. From his visually arresting black and white work to bold technical choices, Hall worked to break new ground with each film he shot. His astounding resume features some of the most beautiful and unique films of the past half-century, and has garnered an incredible 10 Academy Award nominations, resulting in 3 Oscars. In 1994, Hall received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society of Cinematographers, 8 years prior to what many consider to be his best work, in Road to Perdition.
Conrad was a lover. Conrad was a Tahitian. You know, people forget that.
He was the son of a fairly famous author. Right off the bat, you know, you think, wow, well, that's a pretty interesting story. My grandfather having the success, both, you know, literary, but then also Hollywood sort of enjoying the novels with Mutiny on the Bounty and so forth. You know, I don't know a son alive that doesn't want his dad's approval and doesn't want the respect and sort of admiration of their father. So when my dad was trying to think about what he was going to do, you know, for his future, the logical choice was to go into, you know, writing, journalism, and certainly it was something that I think he felt that he had inside of him until he got to USC. Attempted to major in it and ended up bombing pretty radically. So when he bombed out of creative writing, I think he got a D or D plus and went back to the class catalog. He found cinema, more of an art form, I think, back then, but not really thought of as a viable economic solution to, you know, making money and, you know, having a life. I think he sort of saw a connection between the sort of craft and technology that was available and his interest in telling stories. He had some friends and some partners when he got out of film school, and they started a company called Canyon Films. And it was kind of an interesting time, you know, for young people in the film industry, not because film was all that new, but because television was that new. So there was all kinds of desire for product. And then it came time to sort of figure out who was going to do what, because as a company, they hadn't really sort of divided their skills into, you know, sort of concrete roles by chance. My dad happened to pick the cinematographer name out of the hat, and that's how he chose this career. I think my dad's cinematography, if he had to sort of put a label on it, is that despite the fact that film stocks changed from black and white to color, his cinematography was always black and white oriented.
His composition was extremely simple, not simplistic, but just simple and meaningful.
He taught me a lot about to be simple and not using too many lights. One big light sometimes is enough for the whole scene, and then not leave things in darkness. And then he really was a master of that.
And because you don't have the natural separation of colors, in black and white photography, you've got to make the separation through your lighting and, you know, through your framing.
There's a sort of concentration on what's in the frame. You know, color can often be a real distraction, I think, to content and composition and light. And I think that's probably what Conrad took most from the black and white.
You know, he was the last of the generation who moved between black and white and color. And, you know, back and forth, not just from black and white to color, but back to black and white again, you know, when they were still making black and white movies on a regular basis. And he used to talk, you know, longingly of the days when he could shoot in black and white. You know, one of the things that we talked about when we started Road to Perdition was, you know, how great it would be if, or what the movie would look like if it were just, as he would say, values, you know, just grades of black and white.
For my father, it was always the artistry of using light to tell a story to create drama or a mood, to create separation, and I don't think he ever lost that set of language skills. And when you look at his lighting, he was constantly using hard light when most people went to soft light, but in a unique way.
And I think that's the essential elements of Conrad's composition. You know, talking about Searching for Bobby Fischer or Class Action, all those movies have this really, really contemporary, beautiful, powerful imagery, which are also supported by his very simple lighting style.
There was a certain quality of melancholy that Connie carried with him that he was very in touch with. And you feel it, I think, in the films.
He always had the knack of, what is this scene about? How does this shot impact the story? And how can I use the camera to make that come alive and be a reality?
And Conrad was the master of metaphors, you know, master of composition that would evoke certain emotions without being too obvious.
He had certain things he liked to do. He liked to trail into the scene, offer detail. You know, he didn't always want to start exactly at the beginning of the scene. He wanted to add a little bit of an introduction, as it were.
Well, his work was subservient to the story. And Connie had a great feeling and knowledge of his craft to know enough that how he could translate the story into what his vision was.
It was a very hard challenge. I mean, how do you do a film about somebody playing chess? It's a small board, it's always the same thing, and if you're not a chess maniac, you don't even know what those guys doing, you know? And by the use of these close-ups and the light and everything, he's made this film completely stand out.
Because he shot it all from the eye line of the child. Chess had always seemed a distant intellectual pursuit. Somehow it seemed visceral and emotional and suffused with a different kind of power, and it was entirely because of the way in which it had been shot and lit.
One of the great shoots for me that anybody ever did is in Butch Cassidy, The Raindrops Are Falling on My Head number with Paul Newman and Catherine Moss. That's such a phenomenal look, and that's Connie, but that's outside. And I think Connie, if he was here, would say, yeah, I was happier when I was dealing with outside stuff.
His sense of the land, of light outside, he'd take what nature has given and he would magnify it.
It was always a huge plus to have Conrad along, because you knew whatever the elements of the story were in the screenplay, he would make them work.
One of the things I think of is I think of that bicycle wheel, turning around and around and around, and the spokes becoming kaleidoscope-like. I have no way of knowing whether that was George Roy Hill or Conrad Hall, but there are so many of those in Connie's movies. Seeing Paul Newman through the pickets of the fence. And I think that's Connie's search for the truth. If I were alive during the time of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and I was standing on this hillside with Butch and Sundance and Etta, maybe I'd be seeing him through these pickets. It makes it real. It puts me in that place. I think that's, you know, Connie.
Been my dad's downfall. But on the other hand, you know, working with the laboratory, he ended up with some pretty spectacular footage, albeit not what the studio or he was expecting. Ended up, you know, getting a nomination out of that film.
He was quite honest about how some things would sort of happen, like he said once on Fat City, for instance, that they shot a lot of kind of documentary observational footage for the opening sequence. I think it was in a pre-production period. And he said they put the wrong stock on us. He put a higher speed stock on than he thought, and everything was really kind of bright and blown out. Now, I don't know if that's just him telling a story or what, but the exteriors have this a wonderful blown out feel, and he took it all the way through the film.
Many, many times he lit shots created images, framed scenes, because things happened that he could not foresee or even wanted to control.
To have the confidence to allow scenes to happen in front of you and not always to dictate to them sometimes teaches you more about the scene than you thought you knew.
We don't always know about each other's happy accidents. I mean, the only way you're going to find out about that is if somebody comes out and talks about it, as Connie did in Cold Blood, when he had that wonderful shot of the effect of tears running down Robert Blake's face when he's standing by a window. He said that was purely an accident. He had a light coming through the window, and it was supposedly a rain sequence outside, and so they had droplets on the window, and this thing happened, and he looked at it and he saw it, and then he got the director and he said, "Look at this, this is great." So they shot it, and they captured it, and as he said, that's a happy accident.
But you've got to be clever enough to spot them when they come along, and also, I kind of only half believe him. You know what I mean? You sort of, it's like saying someone splashing paint on a canvas is an accident. There's not much accidental. It's just being open to inspiration.
Ultimately, Connie was not someone who said, "I know what let's do, let's throw this out and do this." He was one who would figure out how to make what he had work. And he was very, very good at that.
He did very bold choices, and there's two ways you can do bold choices. One is because you're ignorant, the other one because you just don't like the establishment. You don't like what has been done.
Connie was very, very much right in the forefront of that change that happened in cinematography, in mainstream cinematography, in mainstream Hollywood filmmaking. To see somebody like Connie shooting a Hollywood movie and taking those kinds of risks that they did, I mean, then that sort of said, well, we can actually do that. I don't have to, operate under a sort of set of rules with a certain formula, I think that's the big influence.
To allow flares in is to indicate out of control. I mean, when you have a pristine picture, it subjectively sends off ideas of control.
Normally, you would have 3-4 grips constantly trying to control the light so there will be no flare. He forget about it. He just told them to not do that, and he started using that to tell the story.
And like Butch Cassidy in a Sundance Kid, he actually practically took out all the colors. Actually, it was only 1 or 2 colors there, and then in the desert, and it was bright, and that was the style for the movie.
He was one of the first guys to process film in a unique way. Tendency with most cinematography out there, and it's certainly back in the day, was you create the fattest negative possible, the most opportunity to affect your latitude both in the underexposure range and then the overexposure range. For my dad, he wanted to, what he called, torture the film stock. And so what he would do is, this light, for instance, he would read it, and then he would overexpose at 2 stops. Now, why would anybody do that? Because he knew that certain film stocks had the latitude to be printed back down in ways that created an image that was softer, was more gentler in terms of color saturation, and more pleasing to his eye.
I don't think he woke up every day and said, "I'm here to break the rules." I think he was chasing the truth, and sometimes the rules didn't lend themselves to finding the truth.
He was not somebody that was interested in producing a film that would look like either something he'd done before, something else somebody else had done before, or something that, was done by the rules of a studio.
The iconic shots from Cool Hand Luke, even though, he was very suspicious of that because he felt the studio had over-controlled it. The stuff, all the reflections in the sunglasses, that was all Conrad.
He wasn't a slave to a meter, for instance. He wouldn't religiously take readings. I mean, I spoke to kind of guys at the laboratory, and they would say, yeah, I mean, Connie's you know, printer lights would be all over the place, but that didn't matter because he liked shooting at the lens with a lens wide open. So when he lit something and it looked like what he wanted, he would just shoot it wide open because that's what it looked better. You know, the depth of field and everything looked better to him, and that's what he would do.
One of the reasons that Conrad was able to break certain style and break away from the conventional, almost a cliche way that Hollywood movies were photographed is because he did receive the Oscars. It's because his work as a cinematographer was admired. It's because he was an artist, because he knew what he was doing.
You know, he was a great collaborator and I think probably one of the most extraordinary people I've ever worked with. One of the things that, the first things I did with Conrad was before the first day of American Beauty, I said, so, you know, we've had all these discussions about how we're going to shoot it and what it's going to look like, but I said, look, you know, I've never made a movie. At what point do I say action? And he said, well, you know, the sound guy will say rolling, and then I'll say set, you know, and then you can say action. I said, great, fantastic. Okay, so I was building up, okay, set, action, okay, fine. So we get there to the first day at American Beauty, and you know, little voice says set, and I say action, and I feel like, you know, wow, I just said action, you know, my first movie. And then you do the scene, and then I think, why is everyone looking at me, you know? And he leans over and says, you've got to say cut. So he forgot that one bit. With great artists, you know, you have to find another language, you know. Sometimes you'd use quite impressionistic terms to describe what you wanted, a feeling or a look or a color. And so that's how we sort of developed a dialogue.
When you ask Conrad for his opinion on something, like if you wanted him to see a picture that you did, some of your work, you had to be prepared for a critique, a real critique, because Connie would say whatever was on his mind, however he felt about it. He didn't care whether he hurt your feelings or not. He was going to tell you the truth. And that's what I loved about the man. He was just, whatever was on his mind came right out of his mouth, and in a nice way. He was always nice about everything, but he'd say it as he saw it.
He also had a really strong sense of what was honest. You know, the camera was not something to be toyed with. Part of our movie took place on a Russian boat, and I can't remember for the life of me why, but I had a shot in my head where we were sort of off the boat shooting onto the boat. And he looked at me and said, why would you do that? Whose point of view is that? Is that the seagull's point of view? What? And he was right. He was absolutely right.
It's difficult to describe why a relationship works, particularly between a 34-year-old, as I was then, you know, theatre director who never touched a, you know, a frame of film in his life, and a 73-year-old who had been working his entire lifetime on film. But it worked. The first week was rocky, you know. I wasn't confident enough to really be clear about what I wanted. He wasn't confident enough to tell me when he thought it wasn't very good, you know. So the moment he became able to tell me when he thought the acting wasn't great and I thought the camera, the lighting wasn't great, was the moment it started to work. It was just about honesty, and as a consequence, it was feisty, you know. We did have our moments.
Initially, it was sort of tempestuous. I mean, Conrad was probably the finest, finest American cinematographer. My body of work was fairly slim. People were there because Warren Beatty was there, not because Glenn Caron was there, and I think Connie among them. My methodology at that time was to be someone who planned. And Connie, it was almost jazz-like. He would see the scene, and he almost didn't want to know because he wanted to be able to experience the scene for the first time and feel his reaction to it and move accordingly. Planning and jazz don't necessarily go together all the time. So it took me a while to understand that at times it's better to lay back and let other people do what they do. It's interesting when you work with people that you admire enormously.
When he did Road to Perdition, which I thought was his best work, probably, or close to it, and I told him so. And that was, to me, a masterpiece of cinematography.
Road to Perdition is almost an opera. It's an operatic film, but he never uses highly dramatic, recognizable element to bring up the drama, and still, it's a very dramatic film. In the light, in the way it's lit, in the way it's composed, it's the way the camera moves. It's very, very dramatic, but profoundly grounded on realism.
I mean, it could almost be a black and white film. He did say he wanted it to be, he wanted the final print to be more black and white than it was. He wanted to do a processing on it that gave it much more contrast and less saturation than it actually has as a final image. But you look at those compositions and the lighting in that film, it could almost be a black and white film, the way he approached it, you know.
It's a classic film noir. And I personally like film noir. I mean, I grew up on silent films, black and white films. And that was wonderful that Conrad could create any style really he wanted for that particular movie.
It was just such a simply but yet beautifully composed movie that composition will never go away from my memory.
Things like action and especially violence, he was particularly offended by.
He was very resistant to Road to Perdition in the first instance, and I think that if it hadn't been me and we hadn't already had this great time on American Beauty, I'm not sure he would have done it. You had to remind him about the theme of the film a lot in order to stop him thinking it was, violence for the sake of violence.
Where it didn't make a comment, where the film didn't make a comment about the violence, that's what he really despaired about modern American films, really.
It's not my kind of film. I like moral and ethical dilemma, and without a lot of shooting and that kind of thing is what I prefer to do. But on the other hand, anytime Sam Mendes wants me to shoot a film for him, I'll be there.
Conrad deeply liked and respected Sam Mendes. He wanted to work with, help, and be a participant in Sam Mendes.
I would bet you that young cinematographers, kids who were still in film school, etc., talk about Conrad Hall almost on a daily basis, because not only was he so successful and so honored, the work is so startling and it's different.
How he balanced so perfectly a tendency to do things as real and as naturalistic as possible and a very high sense of drama.
His impact speaks for itself. It's the films that he worked on that are left behind that will last forever, that are classics. It's his work and the memory of him as a person, actually, his humility and his just love of the craft, just love of filmmaking.
It was so sad when he passed away because, from a selfish standpoint too, I wanted to see more of his work. Besides missing the man as a friend, I missed his art.
Conrad Hall lived this life in our communities as directors of photography is an enriching experience to us. And the enriching experience is his technical and professional ability and integrating it with a person of high character and true artistic sensibilities.
I think that Conrad's work is almost flawless. Put it this way, he won the Academy Award for both the movies I directed with him as cinematographer, and he deserved it.
Conrad set the bar for a lot of cinematographers. His passion for filmmaking just emanated from him all over the place.
I can't tell you how much I miss him. I miss him as a person, and I think about him all the time when I'm making a film, all the time. How would Conrad do this? And I don't think I'm the only one. I think there are a lot of cinematographers out there who think the same thing. He had an uncanny ability to just cut out all the bullshit and go straight to the heart of something.